Hello friends, good afternoon. Welcome to CEC-UGC lecture. Dear friends, as you know, we are carrying a lecture series on Western political thought, and today we will be having lecture on political thought of Bentham. And to take this lecture, we have our subject expert Dr. Satish Kumar Jha with us, and he is Associate Professor, Department of Political Science, Aryabhat College, University of Delhi. Dr. Jha is teaching since last 25 years with a specialization in political thoughts and Indian politics. So with this, I would like to welcome Dr. Jha to our studios and request him to begin his lecture. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Smita ji. In fact, today's lecture we are going to have on political thought of Bentham, European Western political thinker who hailed from Britain, and through his ideas and writings has left indelible imprint on the whole corpus of knowledge which is known as political thought. Bentham was an interesting thinker. In fact, in the sense that though he is studied in political theory, political philosophy, and basically all branches of social science, but his impact on jurisprudence and on law has been no less important. To some extent, a lot of commentators and scholars believe that he was more of a philosopher of jurisprudence and the theorist of law than, so to say, a pure political philosopher. So, in fact, he had a very wide ranging impact and influence on whole corpus of ideas which are normally studied and basically handled in social science and philosophy. Bentham, he was someone who was who was in 18th century, and some of his writings became quite popular during his lifetime. Interestingly, Bentham's father was a lawyer, a barrister, and perhaps wanted his son also to become a barrister like him, and he also attained the degree of law. But at the bar, he was not quite successful because his perhaps mind and heart lay elsewhere, and this is how he moved from practicing lawyer to a kind of philosopher and the theorist of law. He studied at Oxford and also secured his law degree from a very prestigious institution in Britain, but his impact was so massive that his influence was not only confined to Britain, but even other countries like France and other places. He was given a high respect and high regard because of the sheer force in his ideas and his knowledge. Now, Bentham interestingly comes from a period which is known as the modern period in Europe, a period about which we have been discussing in context of Western political thought. And as it is well known that the context always plays important role in the evolution of the political ideas of thinkers, and Bentham is no exception. Now, Britain at that, Europe at that time, that is 18th century, was passing from a very crucial phase in its history, particularly the history of modernity, history of capitalism, history of industrialization, and so on and so forth. So, therefore, what happened that industrial revolution was taking place, massive industrialization was taking place, but most importantly the transition from feudalism to capitalism was also underway. And this transition initially had created many contradictions. For example, one of the contradiction is that this transition politically meant that the new emerging class, the middle class, this bourgeoisie, would basically render control on the political system or at least wield power. But what happened that the old ruling class of European societies, the aristocracy, which was the remnant of the feudal system, was not readily giving up power. So, therefore, there was a conflict of interest also. And for example, in Britain, the main most important political institutions like House of Lords and Commons, aristocracy had a very major presence, and this was being resented by this new emerging class. So therefore, what happens that gradually you find that number of thinkers emerging on the scene who are basically articulating and championing the cause of the new middle class in different ways at different points of time in the history of modern Europe. And Bentham's political thought should also be seen in the context of this new emerging situation. For example, in fact, as we have seen earlier, that how initially the kind of free market, or what we normally know in political science as theory of laissez-faireism, philosophy of laissez-faireism, that the best government is that which governs the least. That principle was perhaps the cherished principle for this new class, but gradually the same class and its requirements started changing. Now, it was not simply interested in just free enterprises, it was not simply interested in unbridled market, but it also required some amount of regulation, some amount of law, some amount of codification of laws and principles. And it is here that the importance of Bentham's intervention can be seen, because perhaps one of the pioneer in the area of this codification of law is Bentham. And therefore, Bentham's impact on the positive laws, what is normally known in jurisprudence as positive law, is even today acknowledged, even after passage of so many years and so many centuries, because this entire discourse, the new discourse, of course, the tradition of law was not new to Europe. It basically went back to, it goes back to the Roman period, but nonetheless, in modern times, this new attempt to codify laws, to basically turn laws into scientific enterprises, to bring precision, perfection, generality in this entire exercise. All these things one can say started with Bentham. But it was not only in terms of this jurisprudence, codification of law, etc., but it also ranged from law and jurisprudence to different areas of human life. For example, morality, for example, the politics, for example, this entire discourse on political obligation, that is, why should we obey the state, or the function of a state, or for example, this entire discourse on rights, on liberty, on equality, on justice. All these things one can say were reflected upon by Bentham, if not directly, then definitely in a indirect fashion you have basically ample evidences where you can say that Bentham was continuously engaging with these issues. So therefore, as a multifaceted personality, Bentham is quite interesting, quite important and significant for understanding Western political thought, as well as for basically the history of ideas, or history of political ideas, or history of the modern philosophy. So therefore, Bentham's political thought deserves a very close scrutiny and our attention. Now, interestingly, a old product of Oxford, Bentham, when he was coming back after casting his vote in one election, he basically chanced upon a book in a bookshop by Priestley, and that basically for him became a lifelong companion in terms of idea. So much so that in his words, it was like Archimedes' joy when he basically came across that famous discovery. So therefore, what happened, this book which he chanced upon in the bookshop and carried that famous statement that greatest happiness of greatest number, and which Priestley interestingly had taken or borrowed from Hudson, and therefore this reached to Bentham through Priestley. So therefore, this greatest happiness of greatest number turned out to be a principle, a governing principle for his entire philosophy throughout his life, and it is largely on account of this fascination with this principle that ultimately he is ended up as a utilitarian philosopher, because Bentham even today is known as a utilitarian thinker who considered and who believed that utility is the sole criterion on basis of which one can test both political power manifesting through a state, one can test the function of individual and every human action in society, whether that is useful or not. So, utility becomes the criterion, and not only utility, but even in utility basically this happiness principle, that what is happiness, because in that famous book this principles of introduction to the principles of morals and legislation, which was published in 1789, he said that human beings are under two sovereign masters, and they are basically this pleasure and happiness, and this principle that everyone seeks to basically avoid pain and everyone seeks to attain pleasure. This is the governing principle of human life. So, this is how he came to formulate his entire doctrine, which has come to us as utilitarian political thought or utilitarian political thinking. Of course, this entire utilitarianism, which is also sometimes referred as hedonistic principle, this pleasure based principle, that the entire definition of goodness revolves around this happiness and pleasure, is basically not he is not the originator of this principle in philosophy. In fact, what happens that he borrowed it from Epicurus, the famous Greek thinker of 4th century BC, and secondly this action thing, that everything has to be judged, every action has to be judged in terms of the consequences, whether the consequences are good or consequences are bad. Also, in fact, this principle is based on the association principle of Hartley, and therefore, when Hartley said that all ideas are derived from senses, and therefore pleasure is also individual sensation. Now, this principle he also borrowed from another thinker. So, therefore, he borrowed number of ideas, number of principles from different thinkers of different period, and basically combined them into something very interesting and something quite fantastic, which has come to us as utilitarian political theory or utilitarian political thought. For example, the theory of knowledge, he basically drew heavily on Locke and Hume. Pleasure and pain calculus, he basically drew on Helvetius. For example, again sympathy and antipathy principles he basically borrowed from Hume, and therefore, what one can say that he basically borrowed ideas from different sources, from different traditions, from different thinkers, but creatively harnessed them according to his own ideological and philosophical disposition, and basically came out with something very interesting, what has come to us as utilitarian political thinking or utilitarian political thought. Now, some of the writings which he produced are worth basically mentioning. For example, in 1776 he published that famous book called Fragments on Government. In 1789 he published another important book, that is Introduction to the Principles of Moral and Legislation. And in fact, apart from these two important tracts which he wrote, in fact there are number of papers which were authored by him. For example, paper on jurisprudence, on evidence, on punishment, and so on and so forth. So, in different areas of law and jurisprudence, one can see Bentham's writings and Bentham's ideas basically coming and flourishing. So much so that Dicey, one of the important commentator on constitutional governments in modern times, writes that he was the first and the greatest legal philosopher of modern times. So, this is basically interesting to note that someone like Dicey is talking about him as the first and the greatest legal philosopher of modern times. Now, it was not only a political philosopher who engaged or concerned himself with morality of the question of goodness or the question of human action in terms of consequences, but he was also greatly interested in legal reform or the reform of law. So, therefore, he is also remembered today as a law reformer. Basically, in doing so, his attempt was to unite science and law and to liberate law from superstition and similar such influences which were there very much present earlier. So, therefore, he wanted to create a scientific discourse of law, and therefore, this entire attempt to codify law was basically purposefully done to accomplish this task of putting law and jurisprudence at scientific footing. So much so that many commentators believe that Bentham was only indirectly a political philosopher. Rather, he was directly expert on jurisprudence and law because of his contributions, because of the depth and intensity with which he produced his writings on law and jurisprudence. But that does not diminish the fact that his ideas in philosophy have been equally significant and forceful. Now, Bentham, interestingly, as I mentioned that in that famous book called Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, said that law and morality have same center but different circumference. So, therefore, he did not make much distinction between law and morality, though the circumference are different, but they have the same center. The purpose is the same, and the purpose is to basically establish a mechanism of control in society, where basically a orderly government could be established, where the state could deliver on basically this idea of utility or idea of goodness. Therefore, in fact, he reflected on both law and morality simultaneously and in a profound manner. So, therefore, his ideas have been equally important and powerful in both domain, the domain of law as well as in domain of morality. Now, when it comes to happiness, what Bentham says that it is not individual sensation, rather it was a state of mind, and therefore, in fact, a bundle of sensations which cause this happiness. But this happiness, in his opinion, is not piling up of all pleasures. Rather, it was not the result, rather the rejection of some pleasure which will have painful consequences. So, rejection of some pleasure which will have painful consequences. So, therefore, every action has to be judged in terms of consequences, whether the consequences are going to generate happiness, whether consequences are going to give pleasure or the consequences are going to give pain. So, therefore, this consequence became the guiding principle of judging every action, that what consequences they are leading to. Now, this doctrine of utility therefore became a doctrine of quantitatively conceived hedonism. So, quantity became important in his discourse, that it is not quality, rather quantity, how much, what is the size, what is the duration, what is the intensity of that happiness, that has to be kept in mind while judging any action, that whether that action is good or bad. The action, the goodness of action is not to be judged on any other consideration, but simply this happiness and utility. And it is largely on account of this fact that what happens that he gave also a philosophic calculus, a calculus through which this happiness could be measured scientifically, precise, with full precision. And in this philosophic calculus, what becomes important is the quantity of the pleasure, not the quality of the pleasure. This is one issue on which subsequently in fact he was subjected to rigorous criticism by John Stuart Mill, the son of his close friend James Mill, because he picked up friendship with James Mill in 1808, and therefore that alliance between James Mill and Jeremy Bentham resulted into altogether a new discourse, which is also known as the discourse of radicalism. Now, radicalism of a sort, of course, interestingly philosophical radicalism as it is normally called. Interestingly, one commentator has said that this duo of James Mill and Bentham produced a philosophy called radical philosophy, which was radical towards gentry and philosophical towards the masses. But nonetheless, this resulted from this friendship between James Mill and Bentham in 1808. Now, I was discussing about philosophic calculus, basically which Bentham devised to measure happiness. Now, he said, or pleasure. Now, what he said, that when we measure pleasure, we have to keep certain things in mind, and then only on that scale, if it stands, then we can say that this action is good because it is generating pleasure. Now, what are those indicators of pleasure on this calculus, that is called philosophic calculus? Well, number one, intensity. That what is the intensity of that pleasure, that whether it is intense, whether it is deep rooted, whether it is touching the senses properly, then only one can say that this is something which is leading to pleasure. The second is the duration, that what is the time span of that pleasure, whether it is lasting, it is lasting for hours or days, or it has more a period of impact. So, therefore, this duration factor is also important in measuring this pleasure. The next is the certainty, that how certain this action is going to result into pleasure or happiness. So, certainty part is also equally important. Now, the next is that proximity or remoteness, whether this pleasure which is going to be created is more proximate or remote. A remote pleasure will have less meaning, a more proximate pleasure will have more meaning. And then the fecundity, that is a productivity, that how it is going to produce the subsequent pleasure. So, therefore, this is also important, the fecundity factor in this philosophic calculus. And next is purity, that the sensation of the same kind should not produce opposite result. So, therefore, it should be pure, it should be mixed. So, these are some of the indicators through which pleasure can be measured in under this calculation, or on this calculus which he called a philosophic calculus. Now, one thing is important to remember, that for Bentham he does not recognize any distinction between the pleasures except the quantitative one. Whether the particular pleasure, there is conflict between two different types of pleasure, which pleasure is a better one. This distinction according to Bentham has to be made only on basis of quantitative calculation. So, quantity matters, not the quality. This is what made J.S. Mill to say that a dissatisfied Socrates is better than a satisfied fool. Therefore, what J.S. Mill said, that the quality of pleasure is also important. It is not only quantity. What type of pleasure, for example, is there, that is also important. For example, dignity is always has to be ranked higher in terms of good action than other pleasure. But Bentham would not subscribe to this viewpoint, because he believed that quantity is the ultimate criterion on basis of which one can judge human action. Now, of course, the concern of this entire discourse, utilitarian discourse, is not motive, but rather result, that is consequences. What has come today to us as a new way to understand this thing as consequentialism, that anything has to be seen in terms of the consequences it is going to have. So, consequentialism is a very popular discourse in social science and philosophy today, but in Bentham we find that the concern is not for the result, or concern is not for the motive, intentions, but for the result, because what motive one attributes is attributed to particular action becomes irrelevant. Of course, he also made a distinction between, Bentham made a distinction between consequences, the two types of consequences, the primary consequences and the secondary consequences. For example, one can, he gives the example of a robbed man, a robbery. If someone suffers on account of robbery, then what happens to this robbed man? The consequence of robbery has two consequences. One is for the robbed man, because he is robbed altogether. So, this is the primary consequence, but the secondary consequence is basically the the impact or the kind of alert it generates in the minds of others. So, this is secondary consequences. Now, the primary consequences is the pain which the robbed man has suffered, but the secondary consequences is the pain, the possible, the probable pain, or basically the fear which have gripped the minds of many people. So, this is secondary consequences. For example, another example one can mention, the refusal of a person to pay taxes. Now, it has again the two consequences, the primary consequences and secondary consequences. Primary consequences is that a state has been deprived of the benefit of the contribution of the taxes by a particular person, but the secondary consequences are not less important, that this impact on the others, for example, may motivate them or may encourage them not to pay taxes. So, therefore, the secondary consequences here become equally important. So, therefore, what Bentham feels, that motive and intentions are important for secondary consequences, not for the primary consequences, and therefore, it is important for legislators who are concerned with legislating laws, formulating policies, or basically laying down the principles of governance. So, therefore, the secondary consequences are always important, but those consequences are important for legislators for understanding the motive and intentions, and therefore, the secondary consequences are equally important. So, therefore, in fact, in terms of the discussion of consequences, one has to see that Bentham attaches importance to both the primary and secondary consequences. In spite of this concession which he makes for making a distinction between primary and secondary, what Bentham says, that consequence is important, not the motive. Motive is not important. Motive becomes important only in terms of creating the secondary consequences, but otherwise consequences consequences themselves are important. Consequence is important in itself. Now, motive comes into picture, intentions come into picture only in terms of generating or creating the secondary consequences, or one can say the consequences which are not directly result of it, but may come through indirect action. Now, action according to Bentham is to be judged separately. Each action has to be judged separately, and circumstances for action are equally important. For example, in what circumstances those actions have been taken. For example, if a particular action is leading to pain, but the alternative of that action, if that might have led to more pain, then the first action which has generated pain may be considered good, because the other option was going to generate or create more pain. So, circumstances for understanding action and consequences are also very important. Now, one thing is to be remembered, that Bentham wanted it to create a moral arithmetic, in fact a kind of arithmetic where the exact calculation of moral principles could be done, and therefore, in fact he did not believe in a general principle, but a more moral arithmetic, so that a more accurate and more perfect calculation of morality could be done. And therefore, it is not surprising, there is a statement which I gave in the beginning, that in that famous book Principles Morals, in that book called Introduction to the Principles of Morals and Legislation, published in 1789, he writes that law and morality have the same center but different circumference. So, that implies that he looked at and tried to basically not only scientifically codify both, but also to precisely calculate them, or to provide a kind of matrix or kind of arithmetic calculation for both law and morality. So, therefore, this is one important issue, that while profoundly reflecting on law, contributing so significantly on law, Bentham's contributions on morality are not less important. One thing is important here to discuss that ultimately whose happiness Bentham is talking of, or whose happiness is to be sought according to this utilitarian thought. Now, like Thomas Hobbes before Bentham, as we have discussed in our previous lectures, that he also believed in a psychological egoistic hedonism, that is desire of individual happiness, that every individual has only one driving desire, that is happiness, and that that argument which was so forcefully put forth by Hobbes, later on we find that Bentham also tries to carry forward the same tradition in political thought, and therefore sometimes he is also remembered as a psychological hedonist, because his argument is also similar, that individual has this motive, or rather has this desire for happiness, for pleasure. And for example, Hobbes said that every individual desires power. So therefore Bentham would argue that every individual desires happiness, everyone desires pleasure, and everyone desires to avoid pain. Now ultimately, when it comes to that whose happiness, then Bentham's argument is quite nuanced and quite intricate, and that deserves some discussion. For example, the first important principle is that it is individual happiness which is perhaps important, that within this utilitarian theory of good, what is good is those actions which are going to generate individual happiness, but that is not all. The related to it is that happiness of everybody in general. So therefore it is not individual happiness only, but happiness of everybody in general. That means he tries to balance that, he tries to balance the happiness to everyone, individual happiness and others' happiness. There has to be a balance, there has to be a balance between the two. So action, the good action is to be judged in terms of not only individual happiness, but not how that happiness basically squares up, or how that happiness gets balanced with the similar happiness with others. But then the third important dimension which he adds is equally important, and that is the greatest happiness of greatest number. Now this is something which is remembered for this for with contribution of utilitarian thought, that greatest happiness of greatest number. Now if it is seen slightly more generously, then this is a kind of noble principle, the greatest happiness of greatest number, something even a socialist society may aspire for, that greatest happiness of greatest number. But then there is a catch here, that this greatest number means that if those whose number is less, and if their happiness is sacrificed for satisfying the happiness of the greatest number, then that may be justified, that action may be justified, that action may be considered virtuous, that action may be good. And therefore sometimes it is argued that the slavery could be considered a good institution, because it is basically generating greatest happiness by the greatest number. Of course some people, some members of the society, or some human beings who are slaves, their happiness is sacrificed, pain is inflicted on them in order to satisfy or bring pleasure to greatest number. Now the last principle is perhaps quite significant, and the last principle is that greatest possible happiness, and this is something which normally scholars associate with the later writings of Bentham, and therefore many people believe that in the opinion of John Stuart Mill, this last principle is the main characteristics of utilitarianism, the greatest possible happiness. That means that happiness and this possibility of happiness, the greatest possible, whatever is feasible and possible, is basically brought into the discussion. Now therefore what we find, that this doctrine of utility talks about how to regulate our conduct in society. Therefore one can say that it is a kind of discourse to devise mechanism for social control, that how human actions can be controlled, how actions have to be organized, how actions have to be justified. And so therefore, this doctrine of utility believes, or this political thought, school of thought believes, that utility is perhaps the best mechanism so far to to regulate human action or the conduct of people in the society or human beings in society. So therefore, this in fact doctrine, that is doctrine of utility, believes that the right action or the good action is to be seen in terms of the maximum pleasure it can generate. So maximum pleasure, even if initially it leads to pain, according to this doctrine would be considered okay, because in the end the balance of pleasure, what is generated, what is obtained, is basically quite relevant here. That if initially some action is or is leading to pain, that does not mean that, but the net consequences on the balance, whether it is generating pleasure or not, that is going to determine basically the goodness of that particular action. Now it is on basis of this that this theory of punishment, which the utilitarian school propounds, is based. Now this theory of punishment is also quite important. We will basically see that how three different types of punishment, the principles of punishment, are propounded by Bentham. One is the deterrence principle, the second is this preventive principle, and the third is the reformist principle. And these principles of punishment are so significant that even today one does not find a better replacement than these three which were talked of by Bentham. This deterrence means that how it can deter the future recurrence of such crime or such action. The preventive is that how the preventive measures could be put in place, so that such mischiefs or such crimes could be repeated. And the third is the reformist, that how those who have committed such crimes or those who have indulged in these actions, how they could be reformed, how the law and other means could be put in place through which they could be reformed, so that they may not again indulge in the same action. Now what has happened, that circumstances, as I mentioned in the beginning also, circumstances are very important guide in this entire discourse, because circumstances, as I mentioned, that a bad action, it produces more pain then the pleasure, is nevertheless right if only alternative to that action might have produced more pain. So therefore the circumstances have to be kept in mind. Now under what circumstances this type of pain or a action which is giving rise to less pleasure is to be acceptable, because if the alternative of that action was going to generate more pain, then perhaps the one which was taken could be justified. So circumstances therefore are quite important in the calculation in this philosophic calculus, or in terms of basically deciding the utility of a particular action. Now this Bentham was very critical of asceticism because he called it a principle of utility misapplied, because asceticism ascetic thinking believe in inflicting pain on oneself with some higher moral principles, brings self conscience and other things into play, but Bentham had a strong reservation for such discourses. Now when he talked of this pleasure pain calculus, greatest happiness of greatest number, when he said that human beings have been put under two sovereign masters, then basically what he wanted to do, that he not simply propounded this theory of utility, he not only talked about pleasure, pain, calculus, he rather tried to create a framework where scientifically they could be judged and scientifically they could be ascertained. So therefore the quest was, as per the creed of that epoch, the scientific epoch, or basically that scientific urge which every thinker at that time, around that time had, Bentham also aspired to make his discourse more objective, discourse on utility, discourse on happiness, more objective, more verifiable, more unequivocal and also more clearer, so that it is presented, articulated and propounded with full precision without leaving any scope or any space for doubt and confusion. Now, Bentham to some extent was very critical of those discourses which talked of justice as the governing principle of action. For example, when he talked of the Federalist of United States of America, the founding fathers who gave birth to this entire American political system, under which this entire federal theory emerged and made this their mission delivery of justice. Bentham believed that this entire thing was misplaced and erroneous. Rather, they were mistaken in this belief that justice can deliver happiness, or justice as the end of the government can lead to happiness among the people, because he said that happiness everyone knows, but justice is highly contestable and disputable principle. With no clarity, with no consensus, one can discuss justice, because justice is always a matter of contestation, that what is just and what is unjust. But so far as happiness is concerned, it can be more objectively articulated, more objectively presented. It can be verifiable on basis of characteristics. So therefore, he was critical of the Federalists who made justice as the end of the government. Not only Federalists, but there have been many discourses which have talked about a just order, the just society, but Bentham believed that they were totally mistaken, because they were basically navigating a very turbulent sea, because this justice principle could never be the governing principle of human action or the state action, or for example any policy discourse, because it is something which is very ambiguous, very vague and amorphous. So therefore, only happiness principle could be the valid principle for measuring the consequences of our conduct and our action. Now therefore, according to Bentham, utility as a principle of goodness is more objective, and it is more desirable, because there is less amount of subjectivity in it, like other principles of action like virtues and justice, so on and so forth. So therefore, he basically attacked the moral science theory, which earlier was talking of other things, not happiness. Now that brings us to another part of his discourse, that is the political discourse, where he talks of state, political obligation, sovereignty, liberty, rights and so on and so forth. So therefore, there one can move from the philosophical ideas to more political ideas, because in between, of course, as I mentioned, that law is the running thread in all these discourses, whether philosophical, moral or political. Now on question of state, as we have seen that from the ancient time, the most important question which has confronted different generations of political thinker is that why should we obey the state, or why human beings obey the state. Now this entire question of political obligation has been addressed by different thinkers in a different ways. It started with the Greek thinkers in ancient time, and it has come down to the modern times. Now for Bentham and this utilitarian philosophy, or this school of thought, this question of political obligation is addressed in a different way, and here again he brings in this utilitarian calculus into the discussion. Here again he brings in this happiness principle into the discussion. For him, the political obligation is not to be analyzed, discussed or seen in terms of that contract which the social contract theories like Hobbes, Locke and Rousseau gave, because for him the contract theory had no basis. For example, he dismissed altogether the entire discourse of natural rights and natural law, so much so that he was so critical of natural rights that Bentham said that natural rights are nonsense upon the stilt. So basically he believed in legal theory of rights, that rights only flow out of law, only the command of sovereign is basically the law, and rights can come only from this command. So therefore, so far the political obligation is concerned, he again made happiness as the principle of this obligation, that people should feel obliged to obey the state only if it can give happiness to them. And that happiness, as you have seen, that how happiness is to be seen is clearly basically articulated and laid down by Bentham. Now, source of law, related issue with this state, the obligation is the source of law, and as I mentioned that he considered state to be the main sole source of law making body. There is no natural law as the social contract theories talked of. In fact, the state is the source of all laws. Now, in fact, law, which is in his opinion is both command as well as restraint, is as such opposed to liberty, but again even then he believed that it is necessary for promotion of happiness, because he acknowledged this fact that law and liberty can run into opposite directions, but nonetheless he believed that law is important for a number of reasons. For example, one important reason in his thinking was this question of happiness, and therefore the justification of law also comes from happiness, because absence of law may lead to chaos, may lead to many other distortions, many other problems which may rob human beings of their happiness. Now, the question of reconciling conflicting interests now is also significant in Bentham, and that makes him a truly a liberal thinker, because liberalism, as we know, always talks of politics as a mechanism which strives to reconcile conflicting interests in society, and therefore this was also one purpose of this entire political discourse of Bentham, that how the conflicting interests in society could be reconciled, because he basically agreed with this point of view that society cannot have one common interest. There may be conflicting interests, but this happiness is important to reconcile these interests, because unless those interests are reconciled, happiness could not be obtained. Now, by giving even artificial pain to some, if this happiness, maximum possible happiness could be obtained and generated, that pain or punishment could be justified for general happiness. So, this is how he looked at the question of punishment. Punishment in order to create happiness, generate happiness for maximum possible happiness for greatest number or maximum number of people. So, therefore, what he believed that reconciling interests, inflicting pain on others, all these mechanisms, all these measures are sometimes necessary for creating happiness among the maximum number of people. Now, there is another important issue which should be kept in mind when he talked of two different types of actions. Now, this of course becomes quite significant in another thinker's discourse, that is John Stuart Mill, which we will be discussing later, that is self-regarding action and other regarding action, that how individual is sovereign in a sphere of self-regarding action, as John Stuart Mill used to say. But even for Bentham, morality is basically morality's domain or jurisdiction, or the morality's purview is the self-regarding sphere, which is beyond the law. Law should not concern itself with the self-regarding, whereas when it comes to the non-self-regarding spheres, or those spheres which are not concerning self-regarding but other regarding, in that sphere the supremacy and the sovereignty of law has to be accepted and acknowledged. Now, what happens that as I mentioned, that law and morality he often used to talk in the same breath, because he often said that law and morality have same center but different circumference. Now, law, his definition was very precise and very clear, that law is the command of the sovereign, and this law is the command of the sovereign gave birth to this positivist school of law, for which one can give credit to Bentham also for codification, etc., etc., which later on was propounded, or later on elaborated upon by Granville, by Easton in a very profound manner. So therefore, this law as a command of the sovereign, this entire positivist discourse or the monistic theory of sovereignty, in fact, comes from such discourses which were basically associated with a utilitarian thinker like Bentham. Now, on the question of rights, as I have already mentioned, that he dismissed and ravished this question of natural rights, because he believed that a state is the sole source of law and sole source of rights, and therefore he talked about a legal theory of rights, not the natural theory of rights. Now, what happened? Law of nature, which is perhaps one important element in this entire discourse of social contract of Hobbes and Locke, he believed that law of nature is nothing but phrase. So he was very dismissive of this law of nature, natural rights, and so on and so forth. Natural right, to the extent, he went to the extent of saying that they are nonsense upon the stilt. Now he gives all that is, so therefore what happens, that rights, law and other things he talked of in a manner which subsequently influenced this evolution of this entire liberal discourse of rights, legal theory of rights, and positivist notion of law and monistic theory of sovereignty. On question of property, one can find that on the one hand he is dismissive of Locke on natural rights and natural law, but on question of property one finds lot of similarities between Bentham and Locke. In fact, to some extent, for some scholars, Bentham appears to be great disciple of Locke so far as property is concerned, because he also believed that property is necessary for the security of individuals in society. It gives human beings a sense of security. So this tradition, of course, is an old tradition in political thought, going back to Aristotle, but Locke in modern times, who championed this cause more forcefully, in fact we can also find some echo in Bentham. Now, when the question of disobedience or rebellion or protest or other similar issues comes, Bentham had a very clear cut answer, that disobedience to a state is only allowed when it diminishes pain or encourages pleasure. So therefore individual has no right to resist. Now the right to resist may come only if it is going to reduce pain and increase pleasure. Otherwise, Bentham was not ready to give any right against the state. Now for Bentham, liberty is not the end, justice is not the end, as we have seen earlier. He was very dismissive of these high moral principles, liberty, justice, equality. For him, happiness is the only governing principle through which state's utility and state action has to be judged. Now what has happened, that civil liberty he always valued at the cost of other liberty, natural liberty, because he believed that civil liberty is always consistent with the community interest, the community identity or the solidarity, not the natural liberty, which is more individualistic. So therefore he looked at liberty in terms of the social value, in terms of social utility, that how it may give more pleasure to the entire community. So ultimately we find that, just keeping in line with this liberal tradition, Bentham looked at a state as a machine which is there to serve human interests, and therefore is this mechanical view of a state which is basically at the heart of this entire liberal discourse. We also find echo in Bentham. Bentham has also been criticized for a number of things. For example, as I mentioned earlier in my earlier lecture, that Karl Marx subjected him to rigorous criticism when he talked of human nature, and he said that Bentham's man is a British shopkeeper's view of man. He has taken the British shopkeeper and generalized that nature, saying this is the nature of man, when he himself talked about his own theory of Prometheus conception of man. But so far as criticisms are concerned, Macpherson, Rawls and other people have also criticized him. Rawls says that he, individual compromises individual happiness for the collective happiness, when he ultimately ended up, started as an individualist, ended as a collectivist. So these criticisms are there. Macpherson also criticizes him for not harmonizing this equality with his entire principle of utility. But nonetheless, one cannot forget the contribution of Bentham in the whole host of ideas which we study as political thought. I will stop here.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you so much for this lecture. Dear friends, I would like to tell you that we will be having in our next lecture with Dr. Jha on political thoughts of J.S. Mill. So keep watching, stay tuned with us. And with this, I would like to thank you, sir, again for being here. Thank you so much for watching.